really appreciate you being here with us today and look forward to this very special talk with Dr. Michael Jordan called "What Do We Not Know About the Genetics of Hemophagocytic Lymphohistiocytosis and How Can We All Help to Fill These Gaps?" So before we dive into today's talk, I just wanted to give a special acknowledgement to the proud partnership between all the different patient organizations and industry and institutional partners that you see here on the screen. Just acknowledge the Histiocytosis Association, Cincinnati Children's Medical Center, SOBI. We have the Liam's Lighthouse Foundation, Eric's Journey Foundation, Histiocytosis Association of Canada, Baylor College of Medicine, Be the Match, the Immune Deficiency Foundation, Systemic JIA Foundation, the Auto-Inflammatory Alliance, HLH Heroes, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, Penn Medicine, and the BMT InfoNet. Just thank you so much to all the partners for being here, and we're really excited to be able to present to you today's talk. So before we jump in, I just wanted to make everyone aware that this talk is for informational purposes only. This is not a medical consultation, so we encourage you to speak with your medical team about any of your specific circumstances. We can answer questions today. We may not be able to get to all of your questions, but can follow up with additional information wherever possible. So without further ado, I'm going to turn today's talk over to Dr. Michael Jordan, pediatric hematologist oncologist with Cincinnati Children's Hospital. Dr. Jordan is the past president of the Histiocyte Society and the scientific director at Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center for the HLH Center of Excellence. He's also the principal investigator for the into-HLH registry, which we'll also be talking a bit more about today. Dr. Jordan, I'd love to turn today's talk over to you.
Great. All right. Thank you very much, Deanna. Thank you for this venue that you provided for this discussion today. And let's see here. I'm going to see if I can advance my slide. Here we go. A little bit of a lag there. Okay, so yeah, just thank you very much for the opportunity that you provided with us and partnering with us in terms of this discussion. So a little overview of the talk today. So the talk, as the title, if you saw it quickly as it whizzed by, is about genetics and what are the limits of our knowledge about the genetics of HLH. And so we'll talk first about a few genetic definitions, maybe more than a few. And then we have to touch on, of course, just briefly, what is HLH? And then, of course, because HLH is complicated, I think we have to ask ourselves, which HLH are you referring to? And we'll talk more about the sort of the core pathways of HLH, and then some of our unknown sort of aspects of the genetics, and then a bit about the registry and how it can help to sort of fill some of these gaps. So, and here we go. So a few genetic terms of notes, right? So when we're talking about genetics, we're frequently referring to gene sequence, right? So sequence is the sequence of DNA is really the language of DNA. It's right. It's like the computer code of life, and it's this long string of just a very few letters that combine to make letters and words in essence. And genes are the smallest sort of single unit of inheritance. So it's the smallest, you might say, complete unit of genetic information. And usually what a gene does is it encodes a protein. And related to genes are exons. So unlike a book you might read, right? So a gene is oftentimes broken up into chapters, and these chapters are actually spaced out from each other. So these are chunks of the gene, and they're separated by a lot of spacer material. And it's kind of like chapters in a serialized novel, right? You have to wait a week between each chapter to come out. And the terms genome and exome are kind of derived terms, meaning, either your genes, all of your genes are your genome, which is the entire sequence that one may inherit. An exome is really just, the sequences within the exons themselves. And these are the bits that actually directly encode proteins. And the reason I bring this up is that oftentimes these days, what will happen clinically is you'll have whole exome sequencing, meaning they sequence just the parts that actually tell us, that actually specify something, right? And the reason to do that is because it's just more practical than trying to sequence the entire genome. But eventually, the sequencing the entire genome will be sort of routine as well. Now, oftentimes with genetic reports, there's a labeling of things as either a pathogenic variant or a variant of uncertain significance. And so, a variant basically would be, a change from normal. And I put normal in quotes because, there's not a single sequence for humanity, right? There is some parts of the sequence that probably don't vary at all between one person and the other, and other things that do. So there's this sort of soft idea of normal. But if there's a change from normal that's known to cause a disease, or which is uncertain, right, then that's either a pathogenic variant or an uncertain variant. And this is based on prior reports, based on computer predictions, or it's based sometimes just on rational guesses. So we're left with this gray area sometimes in these reports. Now, a mutation is a change which is definitely not normal and which is expected to be harmful in some way. Next sort of term is amongst mutations, you can have a missense mutation, which means a DNA variant that changes just a single bit of a protein, meaning typically just a single amino acid. So the whole protein sequence is there, it's just there's one letter has been changed, or one amino acid has been changed. And there's another kind of mutation that is less common, but it's much more serious, called a nonsense mutation. You can think of this as gibberish. Right, so if you sort of lose your place in the continuous sort of writing of the code of life, then everything gets shifted, perhaps, right? And it really becomes gibberish. So you can see the example here of if you just switch your spaces between the words, can you read this? It becomes something quite different, right? And this is essentially what a nonsense mutation is. And then specifically, there are deletions and duplications, meaning quite literally that a piece of that sequence is missing or it's become doubled. And what this usually does is it leads to nonsense, it becomes a nonsense mutation because everything becomes shifted and out of frame in essence. All right, and so when we're talking about, and actually just to, see, there's a bit of a lag, I'm talking about all these terms, right? So you have sequence, you have a gene, which is a chunk of, basically a single piece of important genetic information. And you have these sorts of variants, whether either pathogenic or pathologic, or they're uncertain. And then the different kinds of mutations, whether they are sort of just a single sort of point that's changed or something much more globally that's changed. This is sort of the language of genetics and genetic reports and clinical genetics. Now, when thinking about the different kinds of changes that may be important in terms of genetic disorders and diseases of all kinds, there's several different types. And this is not exhaustive, not every type of genetic disease, but what we think of most often in terms of HLH is autosomal recessive. And that means that each parent is a carrier of a variant which is disease associated. And the parents themselves are perfectly healthy. And in that case, that essentially out of 4 children, one of them by chance will inherit both normal alleles, and one of those 4 would inherit both abnormal alleles. And the child that inherits both abnormal copies or alleles is the one who is affected. And then half of the children, or 2 out of 4, would be carriers, kind of like the parents are, and would generally not be affected at all. And so that's autosomal recessive. So it has to come from both sides of the family is the simple way to think about it. And that only about 1 in 4 children would, on average, be affected. Now, in contrast, there's autosomal dominant. And that means that this is a trait that if you carry it, you're probably affected by it. And so in this case, the person that is affected would pass it down to half of their offspring. So out of 4 children, 2 children would be affected as well. They would, of course, be carrying it as well, but they would also be affected. And autosomal dominant is something that we don't often think about very often. It's a very rare situation when we're thinking about HLH. And then finally, what is probably not as common as autosomal recessive, but is very relevant to some patients in the HLH community are X-linked disorders. And so in this case, the problem is on the X chromosome. And if you remember, women have 2 X chromosomes and men only have 1. So typically the mother is a carrier and half of her children will inherit that problematic version of that gene on the X chromosome. And that means that the girls, so half of the girls, will be carriers, but again, not affected. But half of the sons will receive this allele, but will be, in fact, be affected because they only have one X chromosome. In other words, they depend upon the abnormal X chromosome, and they become affected in that case. So, and we can touch on this more later, but most genes associated with HLH, in fact, have an autosomal recessive inheritance, and a few of them, really principally only the ones affected in what's called XLP1 or XLP2 have X-linked inheritance. And autosomal dominant is only seen in the very rare situation of the mutation in NLRC4. Okay, so, but a brief word about HLH. Now, this audience is probably acquainted with HLH, but I do think we have to remind ourselves of really important issues because this becomes complicated if we don't remind ourselves of the basics. So, HLH in general is a very dangerous syndrome of uncontrolled and inflammation affecting the entire body. And the word syndrome means it's sort of a pattern that may have multiple causes to it. And so that's why it's important to keep that in mind. And what we think about in HLH most of the time, so the analogy is like if you think of a normal inflammation or immune response that you might have in response to an infection, it's a very well contained and so like a fire, right? Inflammation is like fire, but it's very well contained and very modest. But HLH is sort of like a forest fire. Everything is just out of control. And the reason why there's such a difference with HLH is that in most patients with HLH, the problem is that there's a normal feedback loop that's just broken. And when that's missing, the immune response and inflammation really spins out of control. Now, when we say HLH, we actually are referring to a variety of different things. So HLH is a term that's often used in the pediatric hematology oncology field to describe patients that present with the features like low blood counts and large spleens and persistent fevers that we know are really typical in this disorder. But also there are other terms like macrophage activation syndrome or cytokine release syndrome that are used in other contexts that actually have a very similar pattern. And I'm really referring to them all as variants of HLH. And so one way to think about this sort of universe of HLH is this sort of image right here. And so, familial HLH is sort of the heart of HLH, is what was, I think, most clearly and first recognized as a problem in patients. But there's this very similar group of patients with rheumatologic HLH. And I'll talk more about these different categories later on in the talk. But there's overlap and similarity between rheumatologic HLH and familial HLH. There's also HLH seen in the context of cancer, as well as in other sort of the context of immune compromise. And then, as you can see in the middle, there's even other HLH that we're not even quite sure how to classify. And we just call it other HLH. It's not obviously associated with a familial inheritance or genetic inheritance. And again, I'll touch on these different categories more in a moment. So it's complicated, but when we think about, what is sort of the central pathway that we think about most often in HLH patients, and that's this pathway right here. So this is sort of the central pathway in familial HLH. So HLH that we know runs in families. So each of the genes listed here, and I'll circle them in 1 second. Yeah, so all these genes in the red circles, when any one of these genes is affected in a family and affected severely in a child, then that individual will likely develop HLH at some point in their lifetime. Now, each one of these genes needs to be abnormal. Each one of us, carries 2 copies of each one of these genes. And if I, for instance, carry 1 perfectly normal copy and 1 defective copy, then I would be a carrier. And if the same were true of my wife, then she would be a carrier. And as I already alluded to, 1 in 4 of our children would, by chance, inherit both bad copies of that gene, and they would be affected by HLH. But all of these genes, as you'll notice, they all work together in the same pathway. And this pathway is a pathway that sometimes is called the perforin-dependent pathway of cytotoxic function, or the granule-dependent pathway of cytotoxicity. And this is a functional pathway in which the immune cells kill target cells, and they use these specialized, you might think of them as little sort of packages inside of the killer T cell to kill target cells that need to be eliminated from the body. And when this isn't working, the immune response sort of continues to rev and to spin, and it's this uncontrolled revving and spinning that ultimately causes HLH. But as you could imagine, we know that this pathway is the central pathway because all of these genes, they all work together. And there is some question, I would say that there's some evidence, but it's sort of incomplete evidence that perhaps combinations of genes in this pathway could make you, abnormalities could make you sick. But I would say that the evidence is actually not crystal clear. But what we do know for sure is that if you have two bad copies of any one of these genes, then inevitably that individual will get HLH. The other thing that's notable about this pathway is that not only does it control this sort of normal killing function in the immune system, but it also controls how our body distributes pigment into our hair and into our skin. So a few of these genes, not all of them, but just a few of them listed there, if they are abnormal, then those individuals also tend to have issues with their natural pigmentation. And so they're often described as having sort of a partial albinism, meaning that they don't quite have the right or the full color in their skin or their hair. Their hair may look sort of silvery, a little bit grayish, but that's not always the case. So it can be somewhat variable. All right, so how does this actually work in the immune system as a whole? And this is worth pointing out, and I'll show you why in a moment. But normally, when your immune system senses danger, right, it senses there's an infection, there's something you need to react to, then specialized cells, listed here in the diagram as dendritic cells and other related cells, will turn on T cells, which themselves will get activated and sort of turn on the rest of the immune system. And one of the things that normally happens is this perforin-dependent pathway kind of shuts off the thing that turned on the immune system to begin with. And that's why we call it a negative feedback loop. And when this loop doesn't work, then what happens is you continue to turn on the T cells, which continue to amplify the immune activation and the inflammation. And as you can imagine, this just continues to spiral. And as the immune activation spirals, you have tremendous amounts of inflammatory cytokines, and particularly one called interferon gamma, that are produced, and that turns on all kinds of immune cells in the body that begin to destroy different organs and tissues and really cause the damage that we recognize clinically as HLH. And so when we think about and so as I mentioned, all those genes I showed you in the previous slide, they all work together. And so when we think about the patients that we've identified with HLH, what sort of gene abnormalities have we identified here in Cincinnati Children's during the last 5 years? This is actually a listing of some of these patients. And what you see is these are the gene names. So they're not quite, well, they're like the slide, what I showed you on 2 slides ago. So PRF1 is the gene name for the protein perforin. So it's the single most common one that we found in our laboratory. There's another gene here, again, on the previous slide, STXBP2 or UNC13D, and you can go around the circle and you can see that the majority of these genes are on that previous slide. But there are a number of genes, and these are less common, that were not on that previous slide. They're not in that sort of that central pathway of familial HLH. And so there are, in fact, like a lot of things in clinical medicine, it's a little more complicated than that one slide I showed you. There are a number of variations in terms of how do we get to HLH. And some of these variations, they can be sort of classified into sort of 3 groups. So there are some genes where the body has, you would say, altered or abnormal danger sensing. And these are these genes XIP, NLRC4, and CDC42. And they're kind of distinctive in a lot of ways from patients with sort of the most classic sorts of HLH, and in that the immune system is always trying to turn itself on when it really shouldn't be on. And because it's always trying to turn itself on, the T cells in these individuals can become somewhat oversensitive. And it's when they become sort of, you might say, too twitchy, that they can really drive an abnormal HLH process. And the second group, again, of relatively rare variants, but it's definitely worth noting, are a number of genes that alter how T cells themselves sort of sense antigen and respond to antigen. So in other words, the feedback loop, this normal sort of feedback loop that we, this important feedback loop, excuse me, that's most often abnormal in patients with HLH is actually normal in these patients, but the T cells themselves don't quite respond correctly. And that includes, a gene called SH2D1A, which is the gene which is on the X chromosome, that is the gene that causes X-linked lymphoproliferative disorder 1 or XLP1. And so that's an X-linked gene, as is XIAP, as it's in the name, X. And so those are sort of unique genes genetically. But they're also unique. These two different genes are unique because they cause sort of a variant form of HLH. And then the third category of sort of, somewhat more rare, in fact, in this case, much more rare variants of HLH are genes that don't really affect danger sensing, and don't affect how the T cells work, and don't affect the normal feedback, perforin feedback loop that regulates immune responses, but actually alters how another cell type called macrophages actually sense or sort of deal with activation. And these are, again, very, very rare, but they are kind of distinctive. And now, most of these genes, other than the two genes I pointed out, again, like the other genes I mentioned to you, are genes in which you have to inherit two sort of bad copies. So the exceptions are SH2D1A and XIP, which are both X-linked, and NLRC4, in which case, if you just inherit one bad copy, then you're likely to be affected, unlike these other genes. Now, as I mentioned, the story can be complicated. So the graph I showed you was, what did we find as causes of HLH? But it turns out we don't always find a cause of HLH when we send off a genetic panel. And the best data about this, there was actually a paper published from our friends down at Texas Children's a few years ago, and they looked at a large series of patients, about 100 or so patients, in which they did sort of really extensive genetic testing in individuals with HLH. And what they found was that the largest group was actually a group in which they couldn't really quite define the full genetic answer. So they either found in the large chunk of these patients either really nothing related to sort of the familial HLH, or they found only one copy when you kind of needed to have two copies to be a sort of a clear-cut cause of your HLH. And then the next largest group is actually patients in which they actually found truly no sort of variants or no certain variants. So you had these variants of uncertain significance. And then the next group is those that had the very clear-cut sort of familial HLH, where they actually received two bad copies of the gene. So this slide points out that there are a number of genes listed here that I haven't described to you so far, because in some cases, these are genes that actually encode completely different disorders. So PIDD stands for primary immune deficiency disorder. So some of these genes encode immune deficiency disorders that when the individual gets sick with an infection, they have sort of an ineffective immune response, and they end up developing HLH as a complication of their immune deficiency. And in other cases, no gene is found or no clear-cut gene is found. I think it's worth describing. Oh, yes. And the one other thing that is important to note is that in the very young patients, those that are under 1 year of age, it was much, much more likely to actually find a clear-cut familial HLH sort of cause or genetic cause for their HLH. But in the patients who were older, such as older children or even adults, the likelihood of, in this particular series, of finding a cause was somewhat less. Now, it's worth noting that this is the experience of that one institution. Our experience isn't exactly the same, but it really does depend on sort of the referral patterns. In other words, what sorts of patients are getting sent to your local center. And in some countries, not so much in the US, but in some countries around the world, there are somewhat differences between different different ethnic populations. And so in one country, that one gene may be perhaps more common than another gene. In the US, because we have so much immigration from various places around the world, it's rather mixed. And it probably is, in fact, more representative, at least of a very mixed kind of, you might say, European and with lesser degrees of Asian input, sort of genetic causes of HLH. But again, even in our experience, I would say that probably about half of our patients, we do not identify a clear-cut cause of HLH, a genetic cause of HLH. So when we go back to this sort of, what's the overall universe of all the different kinds of HLH that we recognize clinically? When we talk about familial HLH or FHLH, by definition, this has a genetic cause. And these patients, overwhelmingly, the cause is that sort of that core pathway, perforin, MUNC13/4, syntaxin BP2, syntaxin 11, LIST, RAB27, ROG, et cetera. That list of genes, that is really the main cause of genetic HLH in these patients, which by definition should have a genetic cause. But even amongst these familial HLH patients, we often find, I wouldn't say often, but not unusually find an individual in which is clearly has HLH, but we can only find one copy of a bad gene. Now, we normally tell families that if you're just a carrier of a gene, you really should not be affected. And that is indeed true. But there are examples of children that are affected where the bottom line is we don't really know what the other problem is. And in some cases, we know that our sequencing doesn't pick it up, but there actually is a problem. We just can't define it based on sequencing sort of information. Now, in these other categories of HLH, so malignancy HLH, by definition, is an individual that has cancer and is complicated by HLH. Now, cancer, if you think about it, is actually an acquired but not an inherited genetic condition. So in that sense, yes, it's sort of genetic, but you weren't born with it. In other words, it developed, the genetic problems developed in the cancer itself. And really the HLH is not directly from the cancer, but is indirectly related to how the immune system is dealing with the cancer. So in that sense, these patients have no real familial type genetic issues that they're born with, as far as we know. And other forms of HLH listed on here. So iatrogenic, it really means that it's caused by the physician. And what do we mean by this? So there are increasing numbers of therapies, mostly for treating cancer, where we're trying to turn on the immune system. And we still don't quite understand how to do it really well. And sometimes we turn on the immune system too strongly. And that's when patients develop iatrogenic HLH. There are some patients, as I already alluded to, that develop HLH as part of immune deficiency or immune compromise. Excuse me. In some cases, they may have immune compromise because of certain medical therapies they're receiving, but in other cases, it's because they're actually born with an immune deficiency. But in that case, they do have a specific genetic disorder, but it's not the classic HLH disorder. It's actually a completely different disorder that just happens to be complicated by HLH. And then finally, to make a gray zone even grayer, is that patients with rheumatologic HLH, which by definition means they have a rheumatologic disorder, which most commonly is juvenile idiopathic arthritis or juvenile arthritis. And these patients with JIA, they have this condition, and HLH develops as a complication of their JIA. There actually is good information out there to suggest that many patients with JIA have some genetic modifiers that are related to what we see in patients with familial HLH, and that those genetic modifiers might actually predispose them to develop HLH or MAS, as it's often called. And so there is a gray zone overlap. And then finally, in these sort of unclassified patients that don't have clear familial HLH, that we just call other HLH, it's very common in those patients to find sort of a partial or an ambiguous sort of genetic abnormality that doesn't definitely say you have familial HLH, but is also not quite normal. So practical takeaways. So I know this can be rather complicated, but there's really no way in this sort of technical topic to sort of cover, what are the genetics of HLH without getting a bit complicated and doing justice to some of these sort of issues. One is that, gene testing is really useful in patients with HLH because it can confirm, it can be a really strong independent confirmation that yes, HLH is actually what's happening in this really sick individual. It can also be really important because we can trace if there's a clear-cut genetic cause of HLH, then we can trace it within the family. We can identify individuals that may be at risk of developing HLH that haven't yet developed HLH. We can also define carriers who, as I just want to reiterate, are, I would say, almost always healthy versus affected individuals. And also just to remind you, most cases, like 90% of HLH that we can, well, I shouldn't say 90%, probably greater than 75%, but getting close to 90% of cases are caused by genes in which, we have 2 copies of those genes, and you have to have 2 bad copies to be affected. So if both parents are carriers, then the odds are 1 in 4 that any child would be affected. Or in the more limited cases of the X-linked disorders, then 1 in 2 boys are affected, and girls are usually not affected at all. And it's true in the case of identifying a genetic cause that there are reproductive technologies that exist that can help one to select unaffected embryos if one is trying to avoid the disorder in future children. But it's also true that without a really clear-cut genetic cause, then predictions cannot often be made about risk for other individuals in the family, for instance. So, and I bring this up because, like I said, there are still patients in which we don't quite have a clear-cut answer. We may have something that's not, we may have one abnormal gene, but we don't have a really clear answer as to why individuals have HLH. So it becomes difficult to sort of explain, sort of what may happen to other individuals in that family that may have inherited that same defect. So, summary and discussion of gaps and speculations. So includes, I think a good summary would be that about 50% of patients with HLH have a clearly identifiable genetic cause. And this does depend a little bit on how one practices. So in some practices, physicians may be more reluctant to use the label HLH if they don't find a genetic cause. And so, of course, in those groups, there's a much higher rate of finding a genetic cause because they're sort of not including the patients in which they can't quite define the cause. But also it depends a bit on referrals. So if in Cincinnati, we see a lot of patients that get referred to us after the genetic result is obtained. And so I think we see overall a higher percent of patients that have a clear-cut genetic cause compared to some centers. It's also true, though, that the younger the patient, meaning typically under about a year of age, then the higher the percentage of individuals will have a clear-cut genetic cause for their HLH. Most causes of HLH are autosomal recessive. There's some X-linked and very rarely some autosomal dominant. Additionally, there are a significant fraction of patients that have what we'd call ambiguous genetic findings. It's difficult to say what percent. It's clearly less than 50%. It's probably less than 25% of all patients, but it's a not unusual finding to find a partial genetic answer instead of a clear-cut genetic answer for why somebody developed HLH. And it's also probably true that most single gene causes of HLH have probably been found. The first cause of HLH was identified in 1999, and that was perforin. The second cause, which is the gene or the protein called MUNC13.4, that encoded by the gene called UNC13D, and that was identified around, I believe, 2004, 2005. And then there have been subsequently additional genes identified in the years thereafter. And there's even been genes identified as recently as in the last year or two, but they've mostly been identified in sort of 1 or 2 families. And so they really are exceedingly rare. And so it seems that the rate of sort of defining specific genetic causes has really slowed down in terms of the numbers of patients that we can explain that we were not previously able to explain. Now, what does that mean? Well, what that probably means is that these additional cases, the causes may not be quite so straightforward genetically. And this is speculation, I'd freely admit, is that probably it's the complex interaction of multiple different genes. And in fact, there may also be specific and really important sort of environmental factors that may be interacting with the sort of the particular genetic inheritance that one individual may have. So a good example would be HLH that is triggered by EBV in individuals of East Asian descent. And specifically, I'm referring to Japanese, Chinese, Vietnamese individuals. So those individuals with those ethnicities, when they develop HLH in response to EBV infection, it's been known for many years that we almost never find a genetic etiology, and people have been looking literally for decades. And so I think it's quite likely that there is a complex set of genes in East Asian ethnicities that working together lead to HLH, but it's probably not one or even two genes. And so the genetic answer is not really going to be clear, I would say, for quite some time. And then I think it's a fair point to make that much remains to be understood still about HLH. So the genetics, while we have clear explanations in many patients, we still do not have good explanations or good understanding in some patients of why HLH may develop and how their genetic heritage may contribute to that development. We also sometimes, this idea of can we explain HLH genetically, it kind of depends on where do we draw the line, right? Do we call patients HLH if they don't have any abnormality in the sort of the core process that we see abnormalities in familial HLH? We don't know still ultimately what happens to many patients with therapy, what the outcomes are. So there are really many gaps in terms of why HLH develops, how patients do with therapy, and ultimately what are the long-term outcomes. So to help fill these gaps, I'm just going to show you a few slides about an effort that is an ongoing but a relatively new effort that I just want to make sure that people are well aware of. And that is the new registry that's called the Insights into the Natural History and Treatment Outcomes of HLH, or into-HLH for short. So this is a registry for individuals with HLH of all sorts. And so the registry itself, our goal really is to try to understand more about how HLH develops, how it progresses, and how it impacts patients. We really want to understand how treatments of all sorts sort of affect the outcomes for patients with HLH, and of course learn sort of what are the long-term implications of having developed HLH and been treated for HLH. Now, who can participate? So the registry is open to anybody in North America that has been diagnosed with any form of HLH at all. And I'll explain why in a second, why it's only open to individuals in North America. And maybe that's on the next slide here. So yeah, and this I think will hopefully make it clear why. So if you were to sign up for the registry with your consent, we would actually go back to the medical institutions that treated you or your child for HLH, and we would request the records from them for a period of approximately 5 years after that diagnosis was made. And the reason why we're only enrolling patients from North America is because we're not really equipped to be able to analyze medical records that are not in English, and they're not sort of in the typical format that we see in the US and Canada. And so we'll gather information from those records into an extensive database to really understand all of these aspects of HLH that really need more information to sort of understand them more deeply. We'll also provide optional surveys to the individuals or families affected by HLH to understand from your point of view how it has affected your life or your child's life. As you might imagine, because we are gathering the records of individuals treated for HLH, we take special precautions to protect the privacy of these records. All this information is held in strict confidence, and we follow the privacy rules, the US or the Canadian privacy rules, to make sure that all the records are handled carefully, information is anonymized and coded, and we make every effort to make sure that your privacy is fully protected, so that so this is strictly a research project and would not affect you individually, but we would be able to learn for the benefit of future patients and future families. And so I think it's really important to note that by as many people as possible participating and enrolling in the registry, we're really able to get the highest quality data possible that will ultimately have the biggest impact on future individuals and future families. And so if you're interested in enrolling, you can enroll yourself. It's quite easy. If you just go to HLHregistry.org, but you do want to set aside a little bit of time, because we will present to you a consent document that will sort of describes all the details. We will ask you some personal information that would allow us to then gather the medical records that we would need. So you need to set aside probably 20 or 30 minutes for the whole process. And it can all be done online, sort of at your convenience, whenever you would prefer. But you do need a little bit of information, in particular, some personal information you see there, but also where the individual was treated for HLH, so we could reach out to those hospitals. You just click Join the Fight, and you can follow the directions there. And then, once all those documents are completed, then we reach out to the hospital, we gather the records, and we begin the process of actually learning, from those records, what we can learn. So there's an into-HLH registry team. And if you have any questions, or if you're interested and want to discuss this, or if you have any technical issues, we can walk you through things over the phone, or by Teams or Zoom if you like. So just reach out to us either through the website, HLHregistry.org, or you can email us at into-HLH, or you can reach out to me directly. But I got to tell you, my team is really on it, and they can oftentimes get back to you more quickly than I can. But we really appreciate your interest in this topic today, but also in the registry as well. If you have any questions, or if you'd like to just stay informed, we'd be happy to have you on our mailing list as well. So thank you very much for your attention. So I'm going to hand this back over to Deanna to sort of work on some questions, answering a few questions here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Jordan. Really appreciate you. And this was a very informative talk. A lot of really fantastic information that you shared. I know there are definitely some questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to take a look through those as well. But to get us started, there were a couple of questions when folks registered about family planning. And I know you did touch on this a bit throughout your talk, but wanted to know if maybe you can talk a bit more about diagnostic markers and diagnostics for family members, if it's possible to reduce risk. So maybe you can touch on any tests that are available, or ways for families to navigate planning with their care team.
Yeah, so in terms of trying to understand so there's one individual in the family affected by HLH, right? So what are the risks to the other individuals? The best way to determine that is through genetic testing. And as I mentioned, unfortunately, sometimes we don't have a gene. Other times we have an answer that's only a partial answer. So unfortunately, in the end, I would say that it is not tremendously useful unless you have a clear answer. Let's say somebody inherits the 2 bad copies of the one gene that we know can cause HLH, or it may be a boy who inherits the 1 bad copy of the X-linked or X chromosome gene that we know can cause HLH. And so it really comes down to sort of does anyone else in the family have the exact same unfortunate combination of genetic abnormalities? And these are sort of questions for discussion, with your physician, or potentially even with a genetic counselor, in terms of how best to handle those things.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So in your practice, when you receive a report of a VUS gene, what would you do next?
Yeah, so VUS, right, is a variant of uncertain significance. That is, there's no single answer for that. So, identifying a VUS if it's a VUS in a gene that is known to be associated with HLH, immediately makes it much, much more suspicious. So there are occasions where, we'll find something reported as a VUS. It may be reported as a, potentially pathogenic VUS, but there's not enough information that the genetics company or genetics laboratory doing the sequencing can really say with certainty that this is definitely disease-causing abnormality. But if it's in a patient in whom we already believe has HLH and it's in a gene that's already known to cause HLH, the answer is that it's probably is in fact a cause of HLH and could be added to databases in the future as a known disease-associated abnormality. Sometimes the VUS actually may point to a completely different disorder that may look like HLH. So as I mentioned, sometimes we see children with immune deficiencies actually showing up with what looks like HLH. And it's primarily, their primary problem is immune deficiency, but they sort of may have a complicated sort of, their body may, have an sort of an unsuccessful attempt to deal with an infection, and they can look like HLH. So sometimes these VUSs actually point us to a completely different disorder. And then finally, sometimes the VUSs remain uncertain. We're sort of stuck. And it's also worth noting that, this is in part how progress occurs. In other words, something new is found, and somebody says, this could be related to HLH. I should take this back into the laboratory. I should take this abnormality and put it into cells I can test in the laboratory and actually see if it makes them behave in ways that we know can lead to HLH. So it can become a research question. The other thing that's worth noting is that some of these negative gene results that we get are probably negative because there may yet be a gene that has yet to be tied to any human disease, and clinical genetic testing only looks at the genes that are actually tied already to some human disease. And so there may in fact still be rare individuals for which, the answer is there. It's just that it takes somebody to do the research to actually link that gene to HLH.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to note also how wonderful it is to see so many different countries represented, as well as families, patients, and providers. So thank you all for being here and for these great questions. There are a couple questions about potential links with mixed histiocytic disorders, and we do know, for example, LCH and Erdheim-Chester disease can be seen together. Is it possible for HLH to, or LCH, Langerhans cell histiocytosis to cause HLH?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. That's something I didn't touch on at all in my talk, but I think it's something that really deserves to be mentioned. So, LCH is a disorder that we think in essentially all patients, it arises because there is an acquired, meaning a brand new mutation that develops in a bone marrow type of cell. All right. And that bone marrow type of cell, travels to different parts of the body, and it may cause a lesion in the skin, like a rash, or it could cause a lesion in a bone, like sort of a hole in a bone, or other sorts of problems. And so it's not something that generally we think that somebody is born with, though there may be some examples of where this sort of thing could develop actually in the womb, in utero, but they were not, it didn't come with them when they first developed, at least even in that case, right? So, but in some cases, when there is a very aggressive and very extensive involvement of bone marrow cells with these genetic abnormalities that normally cause LCH, if it's very extensive, there can be a very strong inflammatory response, and individuals will present with what meets every definition of HLH. So they clearly have the HLH syndrome, but underlying that is not familial HLH sort of process, but actually is, in fact, Langerhans cell histiocytosis, or LCH. And in those cases, we know that LCH is driven by turning on a different pathway, totally different than what I showed you in the talk. If you take drugs that actually turn off that pathway, then oftentimes the HLH is turned off just like you turn off a switch, and it can be quite dramatic. So yes, there is a linkage there, but it's probably, in a way, almost a different sort of HLH is a good way to think about it.
Thank you. And to follow up to that, have you found any bacterial links yet to HLH and/or LCH?
So if by links, if somebody's asking if a bacteria could cause it, the short answer is no. Cause it in terms of, being the primary cause. There are certainly examples of bacterial infections being triggers of HLH. And sometimes there can be triggers in children with sort of the classic familial HLH genetic problems, but actually most often, if a bacteria triggers HLH, what it makes me most suspicious of is actually immune deficiency. So there's a particular immune deficiency called chronic granulomatous disease, or CGD for short, that predisposes one to a variety of sometimes unusual or severe bacterial infections. And those individuals, there's a significant fraction, I mean, a small but notable fraction of those individuals that will develop HLH as a complication of their sort of uncontrolled or unusual bacterial infections.
Thank you. There are still a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I just want to encourage anyone else that has some questions to please put them in. We still have some time. I'm going to switch gears and ask a couple of questions about the registry, and then we can go back to some of the other questions as well. I think that you did touch on this. Would the into-HLH registry need access to medical records outside of the hematology HLH treatment network? This person's asking because they aged out of pediatrics after their diagnosis and only received follow-up care for a year.
Yeah, right. So, so the short answer is that our intention is to, so when you sign up, we say, where all did you receive care for HLH, you or your child? So if somebody received care at 5 different hospitals, then we'll go to all 5 hospitals or 5, medical practices and request the records from them. So in that sense, the short answer is yes, whoever cared for you when you had HLH, we would like to reach out to them to get the records. So we do go outside of sort of you might say your primary physician or the primary, caregiver that treated you for the HLH. So we really want to know the whole picture. And now if you yourself were a child when you had HLH and now you're adult, you can easily consent for yourself. It's not a problem at all. It gets a bit more complicated if your parent wants to consent for you. Once you're an adult, right, you are in charge of your own medical records and you have to consent for yourself. So your parents can't consent for you if you are now an adult. But if you were the patient, or you were the patient when you were a child and now you're an adult, it's no problem at all. You can provide all the permissions on your own that necessary for us to go and request the records.
Thank you. And I know that this registry is, patients can and parents can, and family members can enroll. Are providers adding patients, or is that something that providers are eligible to do?
In terms of enrolling their patients. So, at the moment, providers can refer patients to us. We are working on partnering with other institutions to help make this as easy as possible for everybody. We've actually found that it's probably most useful to start with the patients, and that's why we started this way. But we are hoping in the future that other institutions, providers at other institutions, could actually more directly enroll patients. But right now, we're asking our friends and colleagues and providers at other institutions just to let their patients know, and the patients can find themselves to the website to consent or directly, reach out to us.
Wonderful. And another registry question, and then I'm not sure if there's other questions you'd like to answer, Dr. Jordan. Is there a specific number of participants that is needed for the study to be effective, and how is it performing so far in terms of response and people enrolling?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I wished I had the exact numbers up to the moment. I don't. I know we have consented and enrolled over 50 patients. And we have already received quite a few records, and we've been working on sort of extracting all the information, and we've done that already completely for a few patients, and we are working on many others. And so, we're definitely, this is a relatively new sort of project we're getting going. And so I'd say we're definitely building momentum. The real question, though, is how many patients would we need to have a meaningful sort of impact? I think that it's hard to give an exact answer, but I think it's not dozens, it's really hundreds. Ultimately, we really need hundreds of patients, I think, to be able to make good conclusions. And when we're looking across the variety of different patients with HLH, we really want that number of patients with familial HLH. We want similarly large numbers with each of these other types, whether it may be sort of rheumatologic HLH or malignancy-associated HLH. We really need lots of patients to be able to make solid conclusions in terms of what we're observing.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm going to pull up the registry slide one more time, and I did put that in the chat. I just wanted to share with everyone today as well. Before you sign off today, you are welcome to stay on to finish a survey. I think once you try to leave the webinar, it'll prompt you for a survey if you'd like for the registry team to contact you directly, or if you have any follow-up questions for the Histiocytosis Association or for Dr. Michael Jordan, you can just complete that survey as well, and we'll follow up with you that way, or if there's questions that we haven't answered. So I just wanted to make everyone aware of that. And I'll just see if there's anything else, Dr. Jordan, that you'd like to address before we close.
There is one question about sort of one of these sort of, you might say, indeterminate or ambiguous genetic issues that we sometimes see. And I just have to comment that, the question is, well, who else in the family might be at risk? And it is, in my experience, I would say, when we don't have a clear genetic cause, it's very unusual to have multiple people in the family affected. But I know that's not a black or white answer, and unfortunately, that's the problem with these sort of still gray zone sorts of findings, right? That are themselves unclear. We really can't say with certainty kind of what are the risks for other individuals, unfortunately. So, and then there was one other, I think, registry question that just popped up here in front of me. Oh, now I can't see it.
I think it's, can legal guardian parents or families enroll loved ones who are have passed?
Oh, yes. Thank you for asking. And the short answer is yes. So if you have a family member that has passed away from HLH, you can, in fact, consent for that individual. And so, in fact, we really encourage everybody, both survivors as well as the families of those who haven't survived HLH, to participate, because we really need to understand all of the range of outcomes for patients with HLH. So yes, that is definitely an option.
Thank you so much. And as I mentioned, if there are other questions or we didn't get to your question today, you're welcome to reach out to the registry team, to Dr. Jordan, to the Histiocytosis Association, which would be info@histio.org, or please stay on and just fill out that short survey when you leave the webinar, and we can get in touch with you. Dr. Jordan, thank you so much for your passionate work, for everything you're doing to support the HLH patients and families, for all the hard work on the registry team, and for today's conversation. This was fantastic, and I think we will be doing a few more of these this year on some other topics, and really look forward to that.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the venue and the opportunity to speak to your audience.
Thank you, and thank you all so much for being here today. We're grateful that you joined us and hope we can further support you in any way possible.